All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Government Analytics program, the Master of Science program here at Johns Hopkins University. We host this breakfast with REI Systems, and the purpose is to bring together professionals in academia, government, and industry to discuss various ways in which analytic techniques are being used in the public sector. And we very much welcome your input both during and after the presentation, although I guess I'll let our speaker determine whether she'll take questions before, during, or after. I'd also like to extend a very special welcome to those joining us on the live stream. We certainly appreciate your participation as well, and encourage you to ask questions by entering them into the chat screen that should appear right below the video. If you're so inclined, you can tweet about the event using the hashtag GAB Forum. And we'll post a recording of this event on both the Government Analytics website and the REI Systems website about 24 to 48 hours after the event, and we'll post the slides as well. So thanks again for taking time out of your day to participate. We hope you enjoy the breakfast. And at this point, I'll turn the program over to Jeff Myers of REI Systems, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jen. So REI Systems hosts this event primarily to try and help create a community around government analytics of people who can kind of have someone to turn to if they can't solve a problem or if they're not even really sure how to approach a problem. And I think a lot of that comes from potential interaction between people in the room both before and during the event as well as after. So I hope that you get to meet your colleagues and have a chance to speak with them as well. And for those of you on live stream, I hope you come to the events in person once in a while. Just as a little bit of background, REI Systems works significantly with data analytics, and in fact we developed and operate data.gov and a number of other similar government-wide transparency websites that frankly have, I think, kind of proven a gold mine to a number of folks interested in analytics. I was speaking both with our speaker and a person from GAO in the room and saying, well, how do you all in the audit agencies manage to get the government agencies to share the data with you? And they say, well, that's a struggle. But occasionally, actually, some of the open data resources provide some tools for that. But let me take no more time and mention just kind of one or two logistics about the event. We will be hosting these events every other month here. We've got a number of past events on archive. If some of you are interested, we've had past speakers ranging from OMB to the Commissioner of the Public Building Service to an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury speaking about data analytics. Our upcoming event will feature an academic, actually. I think it'll be the first time we've had someone who's not a person from government speaking in our April event, a professor from Georgetown and their analytics program. But we'd really like if you would take out the sheet. There's a little half sheet in your folder that asks you for your ideas, because we want to try and kind of focus on the topics that are of interest to you. So please say, here's a topic I'm interested in, or here's a speaker I would like to hear from. And share that little one or two word note back with the folks who helped check you in. We look forward as well to you sharing and referring your friends who might be interested in this program. Just a brief bit of background about REI. In addition to the data.gov work, I want to mention to you that we are committed to analytics, and we work primarily with government. So if some of your agencies need help, we would be happy to help you with analytics, with dashboards, with data management. But without further ado, let me introduce and thank very much Carol Brismakovitz for joining us from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of the Inspector General. And let me tell you one of the reasons I'm really interested in her presentation, and that is because I think that from an Inspector General or an audit perspective, or frankly a much wider perspective, the ability to kind of look around and find where risk might be and where the attention of a program manager or a risk manager ought to be directed. It can be just judgment, it can be kind of just a crapshoot, or it can be based on some data and some evidence. And so I think that kind of analytics, this is the first time we've had an Inspector General speak at one of these events, but I'm very excited because I think it will be really interesting to hear the experience of how to find risk, how to target effort and energy from an Inspector General point of view, and frankly, what probably should be a program manager point of view as well. So please join me in welcoming Carol, and we look forward to your presentation.
So good morning, everyone. How are you this morning? Good morning. I am not a morning person, but I have had my tea and I've had some coffee, and hopefully you did as well, and got some wonderful pastries out there to get you going this morning. And thanks to everybody on the web stream. I know I have a couple of my team joining in. Thank you very much. I am standing up here because I'm shorter, so hopefully you can all see me in the back and you can all hear me. I'm going to try to use this microphone. If you cannot, please let me know. One of the things I wanted to tell you about my background, so it is Brismakowitz. I had made him a cheat sheet right beforehand because ever since elementary school, even my principal couldn't say my name. So it is Brismakowitz. My nickname is B+14. You'll see at the end I do have it spelled out for you a couple of times. You can find me on LinkedIn. I wanted to invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn if you would like. If you're interested, we are trying to develop this analytic community of practice. As a Chief Data Officer, so I'm going to go ahead and advance some slides. Right, you can see my name. So here's the title, right? I'm an Assistant Inspector General now. I'm the Chief Data Officer within Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. My background, I am not a CIO type. I talk about being technology agnostic. I'm really about capabilities. I'm about the data and the analysis. So for the students that are listening in, and for those of you wondering kind of my career path, I've had an interesting one if you saw the bio. I have a biomedical engineering doctorate. Right? And then I went to work on roadside bombs at the Center for Naval Analysis. My mother asked me why I was going to Afghanistan to solve biomedical engineering problems. I said, I'm not. I'm trying to fight roadside bombs and save life and limb of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine. I shifted to Department of Homeland Security, which was very much kind of a political animal. I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary there, responsible for quantitative analysis in a policy shop. So you can imagine I was a fish out of water, and I've now come to Health and Human Services. So this is my first time in an Inspector General's office, which I've come to absolutely love, because for the academic community, if you're thinking about being objective and being thoughtful and taking some time and working collaboratively, this is the most I've seen in a government setting. I see some head nods. The most I've seen in a government setting of what you can actually do in an Inspector General's office. Not to say that's not happening in other departments and agencies and offices. My perspective, having come from a very political animal to now being in this environment, is a wonderful place to be. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, I only have 12 slides. What I'd ask is that you let me go through the 12 slides, because if you start asking me questions, I'm likely to jump ahead to answer something that I've actually put on a slide in slide 10. So there's only 12 slides, there's not much. I want to give you an overview of the office and what we're trying to do. And as we have questions then after that, I hope to have about 30 to 45 minutes to answer any questions you might have. The other thing I wanted to say for our students, I do put this out there. When I read a government executive article about the SES, the senior executives across the government, they were looking for how many people have worked in more than one agency, how many people are under 40, how many people are female. I think I'm about 1 to 2% of that group of senior executives. So I put that out there to say your career path is what you make of it. My guidance to you as the students is go towards opportunities that other people tell you not to take. I think in all of my career jobs it was, are you sure you want to do that? That place is dysfunctional, and that's followed me everywhere except for here. This has actually been the place where everybody encouraged me to come, so I'm excited to tell you about this office. All right, so who we are. We are the largest Inspector General's office in the federal government. We have over 1,600 employees nationwide. We mostly focus in on Medicare, Medicaid, about 80% of our work, having oversight of that, and the rest of our work is for everything else that Health and Human Services does. So when we talk about Health and Human Services, what do we mean? We mean the National Institutes of Health, we mean the Centers for Disease Control, we mean the Food and Drug Administration, and we mean the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, right? So if you think about how big the organization is, we really are overseeing a huge portfolio. And we have a lot of employees nationwide, which you can imagine from a data and analytics perspective. How do you create the communities of practice so that people are actively exchanging information with each other? They're openly talking about the data that they have. From a data officer's perspective, my worst nightmare is that there's copies of spreadsheets all across our network. So how do you think about making sure that everybody's got the same information that they're looking at and that they're sharing that openly so that people aren't recreating the information? So what we do, when you think about $1 trillion portfolio, how big that is, I think that the stat I heard was it's more than the annual sales of Walmart and ExxonMobil combined. Right, so that's huge. So when you think about 1,600 people, that's actually not a lot of people to provide oversight of $1 trillion portfolio. But that's where a lot of people get really excited thinking about how do we make sure that the money is being spent well, that we're protecting the programs and we're protecting the beneficiaries that should be benefiting from those programs as well. There's basically, for those of you not familiar with the Inspector General's office, how do we go about doing that? It's 4 ways we really think about this. right? For those of you familiar with the audit community, we audit. We have about almost 700 folks now that are working on audits. We have an evaluation and inspections group, so when we're looking at national level issues, maybe it's about 150, 200-ish people in our organization. We have investigators, so that's, some people don't realize that we have investigators. They hear Inspector General and they want to cringe and curl up in a corner because they think it's just totally internally focused. But we have a lot of agents that are specially trained in healthcare fraud that are actually looking at external cases. So a quick story, an example for you. I think last summer, if you heard about Dr. Fareed Fada, was an oncologist in Michigan who was treating patients as if they had cancer and they did not, right? And so he got 45 years in prison. So when you think about that case, it was very complex because you had a large number of patients. Some of his patients were actually getting the right diagnosis and the right treatment. Some of his patients he was diagnosing falsely, and so they weren't getting the right drugs. And some of his patients that should have been getting the right chemotherapy were getting a reduced amount because he was funneling that off to give to other patients that didn't need it. Also, he could charge Medicare. So that was the worst, most egregious case that we've seen, at least from my perspective, of patient harm issues. So when we talk about kind of that emotional, what are we trying to do, there is a law enforcement arm to our organization looking for fraud, not only for fraud schemes and questionable billing, but also for instances of patient harm, and how do we make sure that beneficiaries, when we say beneficiaries, we're thinking about, you know, our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers are getting the care that they need. Some of our most vulnerable populations are actually getting what they're supposed to be getting. And finally, we have our own internal law firm, counsel. It's wonderful having attorneys on board. I say that and don't laugh at me. So when we have corporate integrity agreements, we can enter in, we can actually take some proactive action to figure out how to make sure that organizations are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, so we can take some proactive action there. The other thing that, you know, our lawyers work really well with the Department of Justice when we're actually trying to prosecute some of our cases. So that's basically the four big offices. You can imagine from this chart, there's an org chart that falls from that. The place that I sit in is a management and policy office that integrates. We're the service provider for the rest of the organization. So we're the critical infrastructure for the rest of these functions, if you will. So the Office of the Chief Data Officer. I am lucky that I have a leadership team that absolutely supports my function, from the Principal Deputy Inspector General, our Inspector General, and our Deputy Inspectors General. All of them absolutely understand what we're trying to do with this Office of the Chief Data Officer. When I came on board, it was April of last year. I am the first Chief Data Officer for the Office of Inspector General. As you see in this title for CDOs, data analytics, that's the word of the day. You know, it's kind of moving away from big data, but there's still a lot of CDOs in the private sector and now in the public sector. And some of the folks, the function has changed. Several years ago, it was all about compliance focused only, trying to figure out financial data and how do we ensure compliance, how do we make sure the data is right. Now it's really about what more can we do, what's the opportunity that we have with the data holdings that we already have, what more can we do with that, how do we make ourselves more efficient and effective. So when I talk about our mission and what we're trying to do from my office, it's as easy as this: provide more and better access to data and analytics to support OIG's mission. I say it's as easy as this. That's the goal. That's what everybody understands we're trying to do. So it really means, how do we figure out the data? How do we get more data if we need it? How do we share the data? How do we think about our analytics? How do we think about tools? How do we think about the products? It's really to support and enable those other functions, right? So how do we make our investigators more efficient? How do we make our auditors, when they're targeting their work, more efficient? How do we prioritize our evaluations and look at it in a different way for work planning? My office is basically comprised of 3 functions. So that's what this, the circles are supposed to represent at the bottom. So it's unique in that when I first came on board, I thought I was going to be doing enterprise data management, enterprise information management, enterprise content management, looking at, you know, what's our enterprise data strategy. And when I came on board and heard kind of from the organization when I was doing my listening tours and hearing leadership, it's really more about the combination of these functions. So I've got something called data operations, right? How do we improve access to our internal and external data? So it's still that enterprise data strategy, but how do we think about our holdings? How do we think about our data warehouse? How do we think about how we're tapping into CMS's data holdings? What's our access, right? What's our governance? I also have organizational performance management. I'm going to talk about this again in a minute, but this is really powerful. So you're talking about changing an organization and you're thinking about strategic planning and then the back-end accountability. That function now resides in my office as well. So it's how are we enhancing our use of data to make more informed decisions. So part of when we think about our data, we can think about external data that helps us support our mission. So if I want to just look at claims data to understand billing patterns in Medicare, right? That's kind of a mission focus. But I'm also thinking about then how do we use our own data that we already have about HR, right? Having our own dashboards for how many people are about to retire. I think there's some statistic in our organization, I'm going to get this a little wrong, but it's almost like 40% of our organization is about ready to retire in the next 5 years, right? Which we really didn't know until we started pulling the data together and looking at it in different ways. So as you're planning your data as well, when you think about the internal data, work planning, workforce planning, it's also about that administrative data that you have and how do we use that to inform our decisions. And then the third tier that's really cool too is our advanced analytics team. So I have a consolidated data analysis center. So those are the folks that have the various multidisciplinary backgrounds that I love that are developing some tools, and we're trying to figure out how do we accelerate that? How do we put more tools in their fingertips? How do we have them program, create tools then to enable others in our organization to have access to the same data? So this concept of a citizen data scientist, right? We have a lot of people that we've actually started hiring again after sequestration. A lot of the federal agencies were hit with hiring. I talk about this in the IG's office. So several years ago when that happened to this IG's office, they lost 200 people. Right, so in an IG's office, there aren't widgets, there aren't programs that can get squeezed, it's people. So when mandatory cuts happened, people left. So you had a lot of talent walk out the door. So now last year was actually the first year we started hiring. I joke that I'm part of the class of 2015 within our IG's office. So there's new people coming in. So now how do we reduce that barrier to entry so that the people that are coming in, if they still need that same knowledge, or they want to tap into those products or the data or things that the people that had left had worked on, or now that we're trying to be more efficient with the work, how do we do that? And so this team is a small team thinking about how do we put more products in the hands of people. So that's exciting too, because with a huge $1 trillion portfolio, there's plenty of work. No matter how many people are in the advanced analytic team, it's figuring out how do you create that data science laboratory and playground for our advanced analytics folks that have the PhDs in stats, math, and programming, and SAS. But then also how do you create an analytics workbench for some of the folks that are the citizen data scientists, that are investigators. Some of our investigators that I've heard that they're used to dealing with cases and people, and if you show them Excel, their eyes roll in the back of their head kind of thing. Law enforcement is figuring out how to communicate with our law enforcement partners. So how do you enable that kind of environment? And then also how do you just have a dashboard so you can report to your executive and managers what's going on? So I created this rather than having shown you a function of all the things we're trying to do. It's a word cloud, right? What are we trying to do? What are the functions of our office? So one of the big things we're trying to figure out, right, and listen to the organization, what, no kidding, are the analytic tools that our folks are going to need to really make them effective? What are the common questions they're asking? And how do we reduce the time it takes for them to get access to quality data or a product? What are the predictive analytics? So a lot of what we're trying to do, I'll show you a slide here in a minute about some of our risk scoring, but if we're really trying to get ahead of this, it's not only reactive and bouncing ideas off of our data, but how do we say, here's really where we want to target our audits. Here's where we want to focus in on our grants and contracts work. Here's where we really think there's a case that we need to pull together. Here's where we want to have a cross-collaborative team with all these skill sets and think about this in a different way, and that's where our predictive analytics is really powerful for the organization. Data visualization. This is another piece too where a lot of the times I think for any analyst working on their product, you can have an amazing piece of analytic work, and if you can't figure out how to communicate it to a variety of audiences, it goes nowhere, right? So part of this is just taking the data holdings we already have and figuring out how to shift it and display it in different ways. I laugh with our HR director, right, even this HR information, they were pulling it in tables and trying to communicate with our executives what was happening. And I shifted it, right, and I worked with my team, and the only thing I changed was just making it a distribution. And I used the Tufte small multiple principle, right? So just change the graphic a little bit, and all of a sudden the message popped to some people. To others, they still wanted the table. So really understanding then how you can have different ways of visualizing, or how you can enable an interactive environment where people can see the information they want in their own way, that's really powerful. We all take in information in different ways. Some of you are not hearing a thing I'm saying and you're only reading the slides, which is good. Some of you aren't looking at those at all and you're only hearing my voice. And some of you, it's not even going into your head until you're writing it down and taking notes, right? So we have to understand that, and we have to understand our executive team, and we have to understand our analysts, right? And we have to understand our business users. So kind of who's using the information. So some of these other things, all of these, I think one of the most important phrases down here, facilitate discussion and decision making. So I mentioned that my office, we're a service provider to the rest of my organization. We're not the ones fundamentally responsible for making the final call. What we are responsible for is helping inform that discussion and debate. So I talk about how do we create the trusted environment with our senior executives and managers and others, where they can trust the data, they trust each other, and they're willing to have that hard conversation. So one of the things I talk about too, I'm a big believer in multidisciplinary teams. So in my office, you'll see I have posted on my board kind of my, here's my personality type, here's my emergenetics, here's my Myers-Briggs, here's my skills, Strengths Finder, here's all the things about me, but fundamentally I tell people I'm an engineer, so I think in terms of process. So that's great from my perspective, but that also means I have blind spots. So I need to pull other people with me and the team, right? And we think about kind of, right, have somebody that's got a background in social work, right? I have other folks that are mathematicians, have other folks that are public health. And it's great to have that vast perspective. You need to have a multidisciplinary team to figure out kind of what are the new and latest and greatest fraud schemes. So this is kind of a quick graphic to say, you got to leverage your diverse talent. You've got your investigators, evaluators, attorneys, and auditors, which all have their own culture, by the way. Right, some folks have the yellow book standard in our auditors, a very specific way of doing things. I know I have some GAO colleagues in here, right? We also have our evaluators that are very specific with Green Book. And so when they talk about these things, they live it. It's part of their DNA. They know exactly how long they want to keep the data. They know exactly what queries they want to store. They know if they want to keep the same database, and if they requested a database from somebody, they want to have the database they got in November and December and January. And when you start talking about claims data, right, for CMS, they have a petabyte of storage. So in terms of big data, it's just a huge volume of data. So all of a sudden, people that want to keep copies of databases of queries they're running, now you've got a storage issue to think through unless you put the appropriate policies and guidance in place to think about that. But this is all good because you've got different perspectives about what's needed and what the requirements might need to be. So you've got that diverse talent with our federal, state, local, and private partners as well, right? So we've got strike force cities across the country that are really targeting hotspots of fraud, and they partner with the Department of Justice. And so you're pulling in attorneys and investigators and data analytics folks, and you're really trying to target, right, Detroit and Miami and other places where they're just hotbeds of healthcare fraud. So that's kind of that one set of skills. Also with our data analytics. So the reason why this is important, right, I can have some statisticians and programmers pulling things together, and they might see something in the data and have no idea what it really means in the real world about how people might be leveraging the process or potential vulnerability. So you really have to have the combination of the subject matter expertise and somebody that knows the program or potentially sees an area of fraud with somebody that really knows the data, knows how to program in SAS, SQL, R, using whatever tool set, Esri, right? So it's a blend. And so then you harness the data analytics to develop new approaches. So I also say here to identify unknown, undetected, and emerging patterns. It's easy to find, I say it's easy, it's easy to find the things that you know about that already exist that you can put a rule set in reactively, but trying to do that predictive analytics piece to look for things that you don't know exist that you're trying to find, that's a critically important task. And it's important because I think about this in terms of a whack-a-mole, right? Let's think about Medicaid data. So for Medicaid, that's a state-run program, right? So think about implementation in each of the states is slightly different. So if rules are slightly different for licensure for a particular therapist or somebody that's going to do home health, right? If there's a vulnerability, there are some organized crime elements that know, that have their own law firms and set of lawyers that are looking for those vulnerabilities, and they'll move. They'll move. So I call it the whack-a-mole problem because even if we focus a level of effort, that can move somewhere else. And so part of this then is how do you get ahead of that to know, here's where I'm going to try to tamp down the fraud and here's where I expect it to go. And you can imagine then trying to understand that regulatory environment and understanding the data that you have that might enable you to see that pattern that's emerging. So fraud models, I've taken off any specifics here. This is an area of the country. This is actually real data, but it's an area of the country somewhere. So we are trying to identify what are potentially high-risk areas. One of the things I wanted to talk about is just how you visualize information. So we had started working with the Department of Justice, had a data set that was a wonderfully built Excel tool, 11 different tabs for different factors of ways that you might want to slice and dice the data. Not as many people were using it as we hoped, because they couldn't internalize all the information. I laughed when I first met one of the attorneys that helped beginning. She spent 3 hours with me on the phone, walking me through everything that was in this Excel tool, right? And I call her a data savant, because she knew it in and out. She knew all the variables. She knew what mattered. At the end of it, I said, great. I speak your language, and I got about 1/10 of what you just told me. How are you communicating this to everyone else that doesn't speak Excel, doesn't speak chart, have no idea what you're talking about with the math? She said, well, what are you talking about? I built a tool. Opportunity, right? So what we're trying to do now is figure out what are the other ways that we can display the information geographically. And I tell this story, if you've heard me speak before, you know I've said, for some reason you put it on a map and it clicks for a lot of folks. I don't know if it's because even as children we were watching weather maps to see if school was going to get canceled. Whatever it is, you put it on a map and it resonates a little bit more. So we're actually finding a lot of goodness in plotting our risk models and putting them into just numbers and plotting them on a chart and saying here's a potential hotspot in this zip code. There are 19 potential fraudulent providers, pharmacies. It's potential, it's just what the data is showing us. It doesn't necessarily mean that's a problem, but hey, you might want to go look there. And it's to focus the attention. You might want to go look here, right? And if those of you are from this state and you understand where this is, I apologize, but it's true. So we're trying to develop statistical models for all the different healthcare codes, all the different schemes that we're seeing. So there's a lot of work that we have to do because that's a petabyte of data, right? You think about how complex our Medicare system is. Developing risk models across that entire space takes some time. And it takes, you have to have training data. You have to test it, and then you have to see if it's actually validated. So in some cases, if it's a new scheme, you might not have enough test data to be able to build that model. So some of this takes a little bit. It's a give and take. And we iterate also with the Center for Program Integrity at CMS. There's a fraud prevention system. So we're partnering with them. We're partnering with the Department of Justice. Really what this is just it's supposed to be a tool. Focus in to say, hey, you might want to look here. But what we're trying to do, right, is high quality lead generation. So if we're going to tell our investigators you might want to look here, we really don't want there to be a false positive. Because they're having to prioritize their cases. We have a lot of whistleblowers that call us with information to say, hey, here's something that I've actually seen. And for an investigator, being able to go and talk and figure out the case and say, who do you know? That's more certain than, hey, the data kind of suggests there might be a problem. So you're really trying to marry up then what their intuition is going to tell them about a person and map that hotline call and that piece of, that lead that you're hearing from a person with, and here's what the data is saying as well. So what we're trying to do then is pull in other data sets that might raise the predictive lift of our models to make sure that our false positives are very low. So a question that some of you in the government may have heard, Congress says, okay, I've given you $40 million. What did you do with it? What impact did you have? Can you show me the metrics? Can you show me the data? Because they want to actually show a return on that investment that they've invested in you, right? What we're also trying to do is just use analysis to show impact. And this is one of those things, correlation and causation, right? We're just trying to start to understand a story. Can we understand a couple of cases where, right, there was a particular spending pattern. We know that there was law enforcement activity. We did a couple of either evaluations or audits, and then we saw a change in behavior. So this particular one is for home health care. What we're looking for, though, is there a decline, right? Did we change behavior? And whether or not it was just us, whether it was the combination of CMS implemented something, whatever it was, what we're looking for is, has there been a change in behavior? Right? And people talk about it's hard to measure deterrent effect. We're looking for a change in spending. Same thing here for community mental health centers. Right? You see a big drop off. But as you can imagine, there are thousands, they call them HCPC codes. My name is your healthcare patient something something code, right? It's the diagnosis codes when they charge and they put the number in, those codes. There are thousands of them. So imagine running those across all the country all the time. What we want to do is flip this on its head to say, all right, I want to put some control theory in here run some tolerance on this, that if something pops out, that there's a significant change, I want to know it. Because either I want to see that there's a trend going in the opposite direction, right? If all of a sudden this was skyrocketing, I want to know that, and I want to know why. Or if it went down and we can correlate it to something you did, we want to understand that too, because that helps us tell our story of our impact. So I mentioned we're trying to build analytic tools. Just a quick snapshot of what we're trying to do. So the trend tool, so like I just mentioned, we're trying to figure out how do you take trends and figure out in a way for people that understand and speak chart. We're going to joke about speaking chart. If they speak chart, will they understand what this means? So this is actually Part D spending over the past several years. So Part D is the prescription drug benefit. Right? Huge increase in the number of spending from about $60 billion to I think $121 billion a year now. Right? So when you think about opportunities for fraud, there's an opportunity there potentially. So it's understanding that. There's a peer comparison generator. So I've removed the doctor's name on here, but if you're looking at a particular code and trying to understand billing, if you have some pattern like this is the median, right? And your doctor is over here, that's what our investigators call a clue. So it's like, hey, you might want to look at that and understand. And it's just another piece of context. Right, link analysis, we're trying to understand pharmacies, how they're linked, providers, how they're linked. So what I talk about from the Affordable Care Act, right, with accountable care organizations, we want to enable people to be able to very quickly say, who are the providers that are linked to each other? How is everything connected? How do you do the link analysis for people so they're not spending all their time just trying to put that picture together? We want them to spend their time either doing the audit, evaluation, or investigation, not just trying to understand the landscape. So how do we enable people in a different way? How do we get them to understand, so payments by geographic area, we call this tool PAGAR. So just pushing out the data to other people. If they want to ask, all right, how much spending do we have on ambulances in a particular area compared to everywhere else? What does that look like? Trying to create a tool for people to see that. Dashboards, so I talk about administrative data. Dashboards can be incredibly powerful depending on what you're trying to show and what decision you're trying to inform. So for us, we've actually started piloting with our HR data because we want to get the executives excited about what dashboarding capabilities could do. Right now, it's a very manual process. People have the information, but it's taking them too long, right? This maybe sounds familiar to some of you in government. It takes too long to generate the information and not enough time analyzing and understanding what it is. So we're trying to automate some of that capability. We're looking at a few vendors to actually help us accelerate that in very meaningful ways. So even something that we had already paid for that just wasn't turned on, people didn't know they could have access to it, we very quickly turned that on for them. One of our HR specialists was, oh my God, you reduced my work from a week to a day. Right? That's incredible, that's powerful. So in terms of our informing decisions, so part of this is how do you inform decisions? Part of it's helpful just to have a framework for what decision you're trying to inform and where you are in the process. So this is my 50,000 foot scheme, schematic of what we're trying to achieve. And I call it, it's aligning strategy and operations, because I think people think that they have an explicit strategy of what they're trying to achieve. Sometimes if you just turn around and ask the question, they don't always. So what we say is you've got this environment, right? So Affordable Care Act happens, it's changing things in the environment. Do we know explicitly what our strategy is? Have we created clear plans of what we're trying to do? Right? There's a budgeting cycle in the government that's always wonderful for everybody. When you hear about it, everybody loves that process. And then accountability, right? And then whatever's happening, are you meeting your targets or not? Have you actually achieved what you said you were going to achieve or not? Feed that back in and understand what might need to get tweaked, right? So it's a feedback loop. Along our way, right, we don't have widgets, we have people. So resources, you should identify the requirements and you got to tweak it the whole way through. When I started briefing this to executives, I said, this is my selfish way to understand what data do you need when to inform what decision. Because a lot of these processes were happening, but they were disconnected. So people would work on the semi-annual report that's due to Congress twice a year for an IG's office, and all of a sudden it would be a massive scramble. Where's the latest statistics? Who's got which accomplishments? And it's like, well, I got this spreadsheet, I've got this spreadsheet. Well, then which one's true? If you've said you've done 12 of these and 10 of those, what's the golden record? Who's got the right statistic? It wasn't centralized, it wasn't easy. And then, they used to write the report and they'd go, okay, great, we read the report, ready for the next one. No, we should have a conversation very deliberately, feed that back. Does that mean we need to change anything? Do we have the right resources in the right places? So part of it is just building the muscle memory to actually have the organizational discipline to say this should happen and should be better connected, and that's the data that should flow between these big buckets. So there's the external facing and the internal facing, and the internal sometimes I would argue is just as or even more important because it focuses and prioritizes your work, which in government sometimes saying the prioritize word, it's really hard to turn something off because Congress expects you to always do something. What I found was if you can tell a really good story and how it's connected, they're happy with that. It just takes some engagement with them to be able to articulate that conversation. All right, so 2 slides. Using analysis to inform decisions. I've talked about this before. You have to consider how your customers are going to use your results, right? How are they going to interpret your information? How are they going to use them for what decision? You have to really create the products and processes that best facilitate the decision that needs to be made. Anytime I talk to somebody that's in the decision sciences or operations research, it's always what decision are you trying to inform? What are you trying to solve? We can get you data and analytics to answer that question, but what really are you trying to solve? And usually that's a chicken and egg conversation, because some of the executives will say, what can you solve for me? just get the data. Get the data, right? As if that were an easy thing, but really having it spend 5 minutes to ask that question, what do you really want it to inform, is it very helpful. Socializing the team's work and impact for positive change, right? Sometimes I've seen a product that can take you about a month to do, and then it's going to take you 6 months to really socialize it. So just understand the timelines of how long it's going to take to socialize either the planning up front or the verification and validation on the back end. There's some colleagues in the audience that can talk about it from Postal Service, how long it took them too. I think it's just know that socializing your work is critically important for the analytic team. The other part is, I think when you find really highly talented people, sometimes they can tend to be perfectionists. So trying to say having a 70% solution now is better, right? Don't let perfection be the enemy of good enough. You've heard some of these phrases. It really matters. The scope of your analytic work, you can change what you're trying to do to really answer what's the question you're trying to solve, what's the due date for it. If it's a week late, it's a week late. You might have missed your window. So understanding that, put the caveats in, let people know that you're using the best available data and results and models, right? You're going to try to answer the question as best as you can, but be really clear about it. So final thoughts. So some of this also is for the students. Okay. So I talk about do any job needed to make your project work regardless of your job description. Some people in government get their position description and they think, this is my window, this is what I'm supposed to do. Thumbs up sign, thank you. Do any job needed to make your project work? I think this is one of those things that for me, coming through and having the career path I have, that's been because I was going towards opportunities that other people were running from, right? Just figure out a way to get it done, right? What can we do? Try to say yes as much as you can. Find people to help you. You're not going to be able to do it alone. You're not going to be able to do it with whatever resources you have on your own team. You're going to have to find people to help you. It's okay to say, I need your help. How do we do this? There's a lot of really great talent in the government and outside of the government. So how do you tap into that innovative thought? Just by asking the question, hey, I got this crazy idea. What do you think? I get that. That's really dumb, Carol. But sometimes it's a really good idea, and it's worth exploring. So find people to help you. Be true to your goals, but be realistic about the ways to achieve them, right? Don't burn a lot of bridges on your way to get to your final goal, because you're going to need those same people again. You're going to need the same ideas. Honor your sponsors, right? You have advocates for them. Understand who they are. So these last two, I'll call it truth to power and then come to work each day willing to be fired. So I was part of DHS's first executive capstone program, had the opportunity to sit with Thad Allen. And he talks about having to engage with the president when he was leading the response to Katrina and Deepwater Horizon. And he knew for himself that the key thing was, I got to come to work each day willing to be fired if I'm going to make the hard decisions and do what I think is right. And he was tapping into his own inner intuition. That really resonated with me. Of course, I took it to the extreme. I did almost get myself fired at least 3 times now. There's a story I tell about working with an assistant secretary in policy. I went into a room, I was the one career executive, everyone else is a political. We were talking about a sensitive political issue, and it came time for the data, and I actually spoke up, right? So I was the junior person in the room. I was not part of the political group, but I spoke up about what the data actually said. We walked out of the room, this was my boss's boss, turned to me and he said, you are a data Nazi! I cannot believe you said this in this meeting, right? So that performance review cycle did not go well. A year later though, he told my boss, because we continued to work the issue, he said, she saved my leap because she was objective and truthful to the data, and it took me a while to understand that. But I didn't put a message out to the public that would have been really wrong. So sometimes it's going to take a while, But you have to be willing, and so part of it's kind of your own tolerance for when you know that moment. When you got to speak truth to power, and you got to be willing to be fired. Sometimes people need to hear that hard message. You got to know yourself what that dial is, when's it appropriate, and when's it not, kind of what's your own internal red line for when it's really, you got to say something. Like I said, it's happened to me about 3 times where I really thought it was important enough that I was willing to put my career on the line. And it was really critically important because it changed the way people were moving. You just have to understand that. So I wanted to make sure I put that out there because I think that's important from an analytic community where a lot of people don't understand, oh, it's just the analysis, it's spin, we can do whatever we want with it. If you really believe in the answer you're seeing, tell people. All right, with that, I'm going to open up for questions. This is my name. Find me on LinkedIn. I think I'm one of the only BRZYs, except for maybe my brother and my cousins. So Steve Shandy actually leads my Consolidated Data Analysis Center, so a lot of the advanced analytics fall under him. So I know he couldn't join us this morning, but I wanted to make sure you had his contact information as well. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you for your insights and perspectives. Michael Joseph with Prime Dimensions. We're a data analytics consulting firm. And you didn't talk much about IT, but that's part of my question. But I know that CMS has been given great marks in confronting fraud, detecting fraud, and limiting those payments, pre-payment before the payment goes out to a fraudulent receiver of the payment. So how do you collaborate with CMS on that? And then maybe some of the IT infrastructure you're using, because you didn't, I don't think you said big data necessarily, but it is big data, right? So just two-pronged question.
All right, so a couple of questions. How do we engage with CMS?
Yeah,
for fraud particularly.
Good news. I think they've done a lot in the fraud areas, the fraud arena. So, and then where do you go from there? Because as you get better at it, the bad guys get better at it too.
Right. So I think, so a couple of things. I didn't show IT because, as I've said, right, I'm technology agnostic. I'm about the capabilities and how we need to drive it, right? So the other thing that's just happened, I'm new in April. We just hired a CIO in our office as well. He's come on board in December. So part of it, we're reassessing. We're in the life cycle of how do we, some of these products that we have in our office are due for renewal right now anyway. So we're really trying to map out and architect where do we want to go, where do we want to be. And oh, by the way, there's a big push for government to get out of their own, having any on-prem storage, right? And we're trying to figure out going to the cloud. So there's a lot of things that are happening that are just evolving anyways. So we're trying to figure out our own roadmaps, what makes sense now, what makes sense in the future. So that's why I say I'm a little bit, I'm kind of technology agnostic right now, right? I know what I'm dreaming for and what I want from a capability perspective, and it's partnering with our CIO to figure it out. Some people, some CDOs report to their CIO. That's not the case in our organization. We're peers, which is fantastic, and I've actually worked with them before, so I'm happy from that perspective. To your point about CMS and putting a rule in place, so with their fraud prevention system, we actually collaborate very closely with CPI, and our leadership and CMS's leadership actually meet monthly to talk about issues. So there's lots of open communication. I think what we find, right, sometimes our investigators in the fraud domain, they're the canary in the coal mine, right? They're going to see something new. The question is whether or not it's prevalent enough that it needs to become a rule in the fraud prevention system that they can put in place. Sometimes our attorneys, right, they see it. How do we shift that into kind of the mechanics of we're going to prevent an improper payment from going out? So there's a lot of conversation and dialogue between the organizations to figure out does something need to get tweaked in that system. But sometimes what we're seeing, it's the more complex cases. So it's not easy to just put a rule in place, because like the FADA case, some of his patients were getting exactly what they needed, but some were not. And some were a patient harm issue. So trying to unpack that from just a data perspective is very hard. So to your point, it's an open communication line between our organization and CMS, right? Which I know everybody always loves when OIG comes knocking on the door, right?
Iceberg guy, iceberg. I can answer this question. This is the greatest place to work. It's Inspector General. I learned so much about this. I can't tell people about OIG all the time. But what I can answer your question is that what we do, and I was an evaluator in Kansas, what we do, we do pinpoints of fraud, and we identify and provide to the organization so they develop those tools or those systems to prevent fraud. Mm-hmm. And you're correct, the better they, my director told me one time, if the doctors are so smart, they work for us, we have a better program. But some of them are thieves, and they get better at it. Mm-hmm. So we create pinpoints of fraud, and they develop the system so that it can prevent the fraud.
Yeah.
And it's a continuum. It's a continuum.
Sure. Great.
And so the other thing I want to say, right, this is such a big portfolio, right? There are a lot of voices that have a role to play, right? So even with CMS has a lot of contractors that play a part in this too. So there are systems that are put in place, like the fraud prevention system. There are other contractors that are also doing audits and evaluations, and then there's the OIG. So really what's important is that we all understand kind of who's doing what and how it needs to connect or not, right? Because fraud schemes are getting more complex, and some of the criminal elements are really creative. And so trying to make sure that we're staying ahead of that requires us to be agile as well and very nimble. That's not always something that's easy to do in the government with cylinders of excellence, right?
Ask, first, for the folks who are online, if you refresh your browser, you'll see an opportunity to ask questions. We've had one come through already, which I think is a great question. How do you create communities of practice where people really actually share information with each other?
That's a great question. So I think for us, what we started to do last year, we actually held our first internal Datapalooza. And what we're finding, right, having a community of practice, if it's just a virtual environment, that's really hard to do, right? So if you just think about biology, right, we're humans, we have emotions, we have feelings, we have relationships, we like to make connections with people. Trying to connect and create a community of practice that's just a virtual environment is really hard to do. So if you figure out the scenarios or the ways that you can pull people together, so I'm not sure who asked a great question, where you can actually create opportunities for folks to come together. In our Datapalooza last year, we had subject matter experts, program area experts, all the different talent we were talking about came into a room and spent like 3 days together looking at data, looking at approaches. That's how we started to build the community of practice. So it was kind of a bottom-up, how do you pull people together, and then following that it was what's the right SharePoint site or forum or Skype session or whatever to make sure we're sustaining those connections with people. It's the same thing with our advanced analytic team. So they're actually distributed throughout the country. Right? And so if they have the connections with people already, it makes them easy to knock down the barriers to get the data they need. If not, it's how do you facilitate that face-to-face so that they know who to turn to get the information. So I'm a big believer in face-to-face is really important, and then the online engagement and that community practice, creating that sense and that engagement and sustainability, that will be important, but it's got to start with the face-to-face.
Mr. Clark?
Yeah, I'm Charlie Clark with Government Executive. How much of this data ends up releasable to the public?
Great question. So CMS actually has a chief data officer as well, Niall Brennan, who posts a lot of information online already, which is fabulous. I think from our perspective, we don't necessarily post our data because we're using a lot of the data from CMS, but we're also combining it with law enforcement sensitive information. So we have our own data warehouse environment that actually combines some of that data. We will post things like our exclusions database is on our own website, but we won't duplicate if CMS is already posting. Right? They have a whole process, the way that they make sure that the data is quality data, the ways that they're going to report it. So a lot of it's already out there.
My name is Sam Hinojosa from GAO, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kind of cultural things that you ran across when you started incorporating sort of data analytics. And you mentioned about what is it, Datapalooza you mentioned, but getting people together and having them to share data. But what, if you can, a little bit more specific about what culturally they were, some of the cultural barriers that you ran across.
Thank you, that's a great question. So I think in any organization that's undergoing change management, it is all about the cultural issues of the organization and understanding the different sensitivities. I'll tell you, just to be candid, one of the conversations we had, one of our senior leaders had said, I think all the analytic teams should be consolidated under you, Carol, because you've got an analytics background. I think that you can leverage opportunities to pull them together. And I said, all right, well, let's hold on a minute and understand in the organization why that might be good or bad. Let's just talk to a bunch of folks, right? Because there's actually an advanced analytic team within our audit group. There's an advanced analytic team within our evaluations group, and then there's one that had already fallen under me, right? So in terms of cultural sensitivity and sharing data, they all have their own work process and their workflow. We're actually, when the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey came out this year, We had about a 70-75% response rate to that survey, and the results were that we were the best place to work in HHS, which was really exciting. I had come from DHS, which was not at the top of the food chain. But still within that organization, right, auditors see themselves with a very particular culture, right? They want to maintain their CPA, they want to maintain the training, they see themselves as auditors, and so maybe they had their process that they wanted to maintain, trying to have them understand the collaboration opportunities and how they could share data and see their tools in a different way. That's what we're still working through a little bit. So I think for the analytics consolidation, my guiding principle was centralized responsibility and decentralized execution, right? So it's like, how do you make this analytic community flat and nimble, but then how do you still have centralized responsibility for making sure you've figured out a career progression path, that you've got the training for people. I think when people feel like they have somebody watching out for them and they know they're connected to a larger community, what I'm finding so far is that seems to be bringing people to the table, but it's taken a lot of my personal time trying to invest and build those relationships with the key people to change the culture so that there is that cross-collaboration. And I think that's important, right? You want to have the open door, you want to understand what the issues are, and then you actually want to follow up. If issues are identified, be they big or small, what's the plan to get them resolved? Right? So we're still working through a lot of that. The other thing I would say is, for change management, it's about what's your change imperative is always step one, no matter if you read Cotter or whatever else, right? What's the change imperative? What I saw coming into the organization was not that anything was failing at all. Contrary, it was just that we had missed opportunities to do things even better. And so how do you move people from a place of everything's great to everything can be greater? I think for us what's happening now is because of the Affordable Care Act and thinking about accountable care organizations, there's a lot of models where it's still in experimental mode, right? But we know that things have fundamentally shifted. So no, it's no longer just fee for service, it's what's the value being provided to the beneficiary. So the oversight of that has to change. I know that HHS has an agency goal of shifting payments to be, I'm looking around to make sure I get this right, within 2 years, by 2018, they want 50% of payments for Medicare to be value-based, not just fee for service. So what used to happen, right, if you go and get you go get a doctor's visit, get an x-ray, you get a cast for your broken leg, have the cast removal, right? From a fraud perspective, we'd always check to make sure that time sequence was happening right? Because if you got an x-ray before you got, right? If you got the cast before you got the x-ray, something might be wrong. That's different now. Now it's about value to that patient. Does that patient actually get better at the end of all those services? So the oversight and figuring out the fraud models potentially for that, or how you need to audit that, is different. So from my perspective, and come back to the culture question, that's now my change imperative, to figure out the culture of how do we shift as an organization to share more information, to share the data so it's no longer the close hold, so that we can be agile and see that broader value-based care. How is everything connected? That's the link analysis tool. That's how do we make sure that people aren't just keeping their spreadsheets to themselves. I know one of the things based on infrastructure that we're changing, we're actually doing a network upgrade this year from our IT perspective across the country. So with over, I said 70 offices, I think we might have 85 plus offices now across the country. So as you can imagine, some people have good bandwidth, some maybe not so much across the country, and trying to connect either into CMS's environment with their integrated data repository or a data warehouse that's sitting here. That's where we're trying to evolve and think about how will the cloud enable us so that people have access to the data they need. And I think those are some of the pieces that are driving some of the culture things that we're seeing too. That's why folks are trying to keep their information, but we're trying to break through that. Thank you.
Well, for management concepts, and I wonder, when you think about the future of data analytics as a career field, what are some of the competencies or skills that we'll need to see within the next 5 to 10 years? And if you have ideas for how current or aspiring analysts can hone that to try to shape a career path for a field that's really growing and still in a lot of ways uncharted.
That's a great question. So for those of you online, if you couldn't quite hear it, what are the skill sets that we think data scientists might need in the next 5 to 10 years? So when I reflect on my own career, right, I was basically a data scientist working with big data for the Army before data science was even really a term. And when I thought about that question before, because I'm trying to recruit people, so I've actually been given approval to hire, right? I'm one of those rare places that can actually hire federal staff. So I'm trying to hire some federal staff, and I'm going to be pulling on some contract support. I want to think about what's critically needed. I need folks that are critical thinkers, right? That know how to communicate, know how to frame a problem, and then have some technical skill. So a lot of what we're talking about right now is we're actually going out to other places to see how they've either leveraged the data scientists or leveraged programmers in a different way using either open source, how they're working on APIs, right? What kind of technology background do people need? I think right now it's not that I see one tool over the other. I need folks that are going to be like Swiss Army knives that will know how to either get the skill set or can either understand a programming language, so we put them in an environment to be a data scientist. They can talk to the business owner, understand the problem, figure out the analysis they need to do, understand some kind of programming tool, right, SAS or other, right, touch the data and come back with an answer. So in my mind, it's more critically important, not that they're an excellent programmer in some particular language, but they know how to do all those other things too, which are more the softer skills in some ways. That's what I see is going to be needed.
Gloria Corellano, I have a question. I know it depends on the complexity. Do you have a sense of what the life cycle of a new scheme, a new fraud scheme is? And the second part of it is, have your predictive analytics already demonstrate an impact in shortening that life cycle? I imagine it runs parallel to the fraud scheme.
Great questions. So I think here's the challenge with this. Part of even when I've talked to our own folks about how do we talk about the time it takes from when a vulnerability is identified to when it's closed. Mm-hmm. So with the fraud scheme, right, it could be it could be in a hotbed, it could be in Detroit, not Miami, then it could spread to Miami, then it could be in Los Angeles, and somewhere else, right? So it just it depends on the scheme. What I'm looking for though is it when did we close the vulnerability? So was it a particular oversight piece that CMS needed to close, or is it really regulation, right? So is there something else in legislation that's needed to help close the vulnerability? So that's when the conversation with CMS is critically important. I think from our leadership team, they've shifted from, maybe 5-10 years ago, it was really about, well, how many audits are you putting out, right? 312. Okay, great. What vulnerabilities did that close? What's happening now is our leadership definitely is saying it's more important to me that we do fewer reports that really had impact. So if it means we do 200 audit reports, but then we've actually implemented all the recommendations, that's more important to close the vulnerabilities than doing 312 reports, right? So it just depends in terms of how we close the time and how we define it. From our predictive analytics team, I think we've seen a couple of cases where it definitely helped. But really what our challenge right now is when we talk about kind of key challenges is how do you communicate and get people to act on what you're seeing. So we're still working on increasing the predictive lift of our models, because even though we've started to see things and we see some emerging patterns, we're really combining the analytics folks with our subject matter experts to figure out then what needs to happen next.
Wait, that's another online question. Mm-hmm. So a question come in online asking, are there cross-agency barriers you found, ways to overcome them? And I'd actually like to add to myself, what about with the private sector? It seems to me like there might be some health insurance companies that'd be very interested in what you found, and perhaps vice versa, you might be interested in what they found. Are there barriers with the private sector as well and ways to overcome?
Great question. So cross-agency. So what I'd say for cross-agency sharing of information, a lot of what I'm finding, there's either legal barriers that are real, or really what I'm finding more importantly is that there are perceived legal barriers to sharing information. And so whether or not that's a tool that people are hiding behind to say, well, the Privacy Act says, right, the Privacy Act was written in about 1974 before we had a lot of the digital records. So there's some talk in the community about whether or not we need to revisit that based on current standards. I'd heard Micheline Casey from the Federal Reserve Board talking about folks being worried about the government being Big Brother, right, and connecting all the pieces. And her comment was, if only government could connect all the data sets that they have. So what I'm finding with the cross-agency collaboration, we actually took a team, our investigators between 5 different organizations were trying to compare information in their data holdings on open cases. So this should have been the easiest of the easiest staples buttons, right? To share information on what they currently had in their case files to look for ID theft, right? So you can imagine we were coordinating with the Department of Labor, Social Security Administration, VA, a couple of others. And what we found then when we forwarded some leads and then had that hit the interagency for collaboration, it was well, wait a minute, our organization, our agency can't pull together the information because of XYZ reasons. So then everybody's general counsel got involved to interpret them, what they thought were either the real or perceived barriers. And some of these things are legitimate, they're real, right? We want to have protected data for various reasons, right? But more likely than not, it's a perceived need to protect this data and other than a real. So that's already a kind of a built-in barrier we have to work through. The second thing is, even if you want to try to get information in your own organization, right? So even think about Health and Human Services. There's so many different organizations that have different data sets. Trying to get the information in one place and sharing that can be very hard. Even when you have people that want to work together, it's not necessarily the technology barrier, but right, what's the right data engineering to then map all the information to make sure that when I'm talking about patient harm, this is what I mean, and when you're talking about patient harm, this is what you mean, and when we put that in our database, here's what that is. So I think right now it's just this evolution of a shared understanding of what even our data holdings and our data assets are between the organizations. That's where, you know, for some organizations that have chief data officers or not, that's how we're trying to help with that cross-component, cross-agency collaboration. For the private sector, there's actually a healthcare fraud public-private partnership. So you can imagine that private insurance companies don't like fraud either. They're paying out a lot of money that they don't want to as well. So how do you share that information? But a lot of their information is proprietary. So there was actually a third party was leveraged to stand up a shared database. So some of the information was stripped out, as you can imagine, and put into a third party that several of us actually have access to look for fraud schemes in that scenario.
You say several of us. Who's the us?
So Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Okay.
Right. Think about like the big blues, Aetna, right?
And you?
OIG. Yeah.
Okay.
Our third party was MITRE, right? The Federally Funded Research and Development Center. So that's kind of how that got stood up. And so that's also another big database. Then it's the evolution of how has that been useful? How do we morph that? How do we change? What do we learn from it? It's been very powerful, but it's still, that's also a question of what can we share? What can we not share? How do you work through it? I mean, even right when I stood up, our investigators came to me because they've been working that to try to figure out fraud schemes, and they said, can you help us? I don't understand this 12-page MOU that I'm about to sign, right? Can we understand everything in it? So there's a lot that are either, like I said, they're either real legal barriers to understand or perceptions of legal barriers that you got to work through. Great question. There's been a hand up in the back. I want to make sure that we get you.
I'm Subhash Perry from ARIA Systems. I wanted to get your advice based on how do you go about building trust, right, for your data within your organization. We have built some balance scorecards for our customers, and what my experience has been is that, you know, when you put a measure and you paint a picture or paint a story, right, the audience will first sort of question the quality of the data. Something must be wrong in the data. This doesn't make sense. Then they will question the expression, whether did you use the right formula, and then they will question the definition itself. So, okay, hey, you know what, we're not looking at the right metric, right? So how do you go about basically getting your consumers of the data to trust the data that you have?
That's a great question, this trust question. So for people that couldn't hear, how do you get people to trust the information that's in a balanced scorecard? How do you get them to just understand what they have and trust it? So I was smiling and laughing because when you were talking, it's just like with any analytic product. Right? If somebody doesn't like the answer, usually they'll attack the analytic product itself, and if that doesn't work, they'll attack the process, and if that doesn't work, they'll attack the person. And at that point, you know you've won. Right? So if you ever get that personal attack from somebody, just know that you're on the right track. To your point about trusting the balanced scorecard, we're actually working on that within the Office of Management and Policy. Build our own balanced scorecard and do the same kind of thing. I've been talking a lot about how do we create that trusted environment to facilitate discussion and decision. And really what this is, it takes a long time to get buy-in. So the stakeholder engagement and that socialization that I mentioned taking a lot of time, it's worth investing the time up front to have people join you in that process to develop it. Because once you end up putting a target and an outcome, when you put somebody on the spot and hold them accountable publicly to say, did you meet that or not, that's going to change behavior, right? What we've also talked about doing is how do you have kind of the private accountability and a public accountability. So what I mean by that, I know I'd also worked in the Department of Defense, right? So they actually have some groups that will meet that are senior leaders coming together that they're basically no notes taken, right? It's a very kind of close hold with the agenda, and the intent is to really have those hard, candid discussions in a closed room where you trust everybody in that room. There's a lot that has to go into that with team building to make sure that is a trusted environment. But I was reflecting on that for our own organization is how do you create that environment where hey, maybe it's the executives come together and have a closed door session and say, let's really talk about where we currently are. What are the barriers? What have you seen? What have you not seen, right? Which is different from, I'm going to have all 1,600 people available on a Skype call to talk about where we are as an organization and whether or not we met our goal. The other thing that we've talked about is we're standing up key performance indicators and the balanced scorecard. Everybody understands that a little differently, and I think in a balanced scorecard approach, when we were looking at the 4 perspectives, in the government space, right, if you think about the financial perspective, we're not trying to increase shareholder value. We're adding to the public good, right? We're fundamentally doing something different. So there's been a lot of translation and education along the way to make sure people understand it, and figuring out what that baseline is. And I will tell you though, we wanted to script a couple of performance reviews to make sure they went really well. The most effective one was actually our chief of staff pulled from one of our systems at an IG meeting, just read it in front of the digs to say, here's what the system is showing in terms of tracking. Nobody knew it was coming. Nobody knew anyone was looking, but it put them on the spot immediately. And I'm going to tell you, that data cleaned up within a week, right? So I think as you're thinking through the design, so this is almost, so I'm getting back to the process, I tell you about process first. So part of this is designing, when do you want to have a public accountability that might be embarrassing, that can be useful. When do you want to have a private accountability? If you've done everything you can to educate and socialize on the front end, you might need to use some of those other tools, right? We talk about carrots and sticks all the time, right? I have a toddler, right? So there's times that you want to make sure you're doing everything to make sure that it's going to go well. If sometimes you need to script something to make it a little uncomfortable, that actually can be really good for your organization. So it's an ongoing, I would recommend being very deliberate about the process, but think through the education, the socialization, and know that if they're going back to the definition, then either something didn't happen on the front end with education and the right people buying in. I know that can be a problem too, right? They're going to delegate, who delegates, and the person going to the table thinks they're doing the right thing, and then by the time the manager sees it, they're thinking, what was that? That's not even right. So understanding at what level you need to bring in participation. If at the end of that process they're still going back and questioning the definition, then it probably means you're on the right track.
One more question from the folks online. A person online asks, how can analytics be most useful in the finance and accounting fields, do you think?
Great question. So I think in the finance and accounting fields, it's the same thing we're finding right now with our audit group and trying to understand grants and contracts, right? And where the money is flowing, right? Follow the money. Follow the money. I think it's the same kind of approach, right? Figure out what's the critical thinking, what's the data you're going to need, what are the data sets you're going to want, and then what's the question you're trying to answer, right? So I think even with our grants funding, right, HHS is the largest grants provider in the government, and so understanding how that money flows, that's going to be hugely important also in the financing and accounting world. So those are the skill sets we need to bring to the table to make sure that we're answering those questions too. I would say, there are some tools that are very specific to the organization, right, within audit. And that's when I'm happy to have our CPAs come to the table to figure out what's the right approach, what's the right tool, how are we going to pull that into kind of our holistic view of the data and the information. Thank you.
You mentioned I'm Patty Craig Hill. I have my own company called Keen Edge. You mentioned the struggle with terminology and taxonomy across the systems. Are you using semantic technology at all to bring that together or to understand the commonalities of your data?
That's a good question. So probably folks heard it because I think you were close enough. So we aren't currently using semantic technology to understand that. I will say that a few years ago there was an effort to try to create a data dictionary for high-level terms. So when we actually post our reports online, there was consensus for the meta tagging, right? A lot of CDOs work in the meta tag layer, right? What's the metadata look like? When I go back and ask, okay, great, so we came up with 250 terms, that's wonderful, everybody had the same understanding of those 250 terms. What if I want to go back and just look for any work we did on knee replacement? Was in that 250 terms or not? And I get this look, like, what do you mean? Oh my gosh. There's not flexibility built in to shift our metadata right now. So that's where something like that might be useful. Thank you.
Okay. So I think we should be wrapping up. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to thank you very much, Dr. Borismakovitz, for coming and making this presentation. I found it fascinating. And we have a small token of our appreciation, which is valued at less than $25, keeping in mind that this is for the government. And we look forward to all of you in person as well as online, forming a stronger community, meeting each other and chatting with each other to solve problems with each other, and to having you join us again in 2 months for the next presentation at the Government Analytics Breakfast. Thank you.